Hi, I'm Alessandra Kelley, professional fine artist and library haunter. Everything humans do is art. Part of art is learning to see what you're looking at. Sounds simple, but seeing and recognizing is complicated. Brains are funny, and we have a tendency to see our expectations rather than what's right in front of us. So there's this sense of fun in late 18th century European men's clothing. It's almost a visual joke. 18th century European men were pretty heavily covered up from chin to toe in shirts, breeches, stockings, and waistcoats that were almost always tightly buttoned up. Over this was worn the coat. Your average late 18th century men's coat was cut with an elegant curving sweep down the front, from a cutaway open V-neck widening at the chest and swooping back and away towards the skirts. The entire front edge was lined with 1, 2, or many rows of buttons, most of which would never pass through a buttonhole and were only there for looks. It was not necessarily logical, but it was fabulous. And it was funny. There's something playful about these coats. Men of the 18th century liked to show off the shirt at the throat, to show a nice spill of ruffled white linen or lace, and sometimes also a fancy open collar on the waistcoat underneath. Visible white linen was an important part of the look, even on austere plain coats. Even the tightest buttoned-up collar military types still had the neck front open to show a little V of white shirt. These coats always had a lot of buttons, and most of them were non-functional. The buttons couldn't reach the other side of the coat. These coats can only be buttoned at a small number of places, sometimes only 1 or 2 points, sometimes only held together with a hook and eye, if that. Almost all of the buttons on these coats are pure decoration. They're for looks, weight, sparkle, and bling. And they were bling oftentimes. Buttons could be gilded, embroidered, even painted with little vignettes. They were meant to be looked at. The buttonholes themselves were often mock-ups. You can see this in descriptions of surviving garments. The most fashionable coats could not be buttoned closed at all. Even when a coat was cut loosely enough that it could be buttoned closed, it was frequently left open. Buttoning was a choice, rarely exercised outside of the military. And even in the military, buttons were most often used not to close coats, but to hold shaped facings back against the fronts. Here's George Washington with his facings buttoned back, not even bothering to use all his buttons, just enough to hold the facings in place. Or maybe he lost some buttons in battle, I don't know. The point is, you don't need to be ship-shape perfect, even if you are a legendary general in a formal portrait. You can be casual about which buttons you button. Military coats sometimes had their coattails buttoned back to show triangles of contrasting lining called turnbacks, which was another way to make the coat fronts even more curved. Oh, and those military coat facings were cut with curved edges to match the coat fronts. They could be unbuttoned from the coat and buttoned to buttons on the other side to close the coat, but it involved unfolding 2 curves sewn together that would never straighten out properly. Did that make button coats look awkward? Heck yeah, but they did it anyway. And they clearly didn't mind because they had official portraits painted that way. So here are these coats with elegant curved fronts swooping over men's torsos, lined with a jillion non-functional buttons. And you can see the strain when they are buttoned because they are not meant to be buttoned. It's practically a visual joke. There's such a sense of fun to this. It's absurd, it's illogical, it's delightful. Okay, here's the part about seeing what you're looking at. So I've shown you these things, and I hope you've been able to see what I've been talking about. But of course, times change and fashions change. At the end of the 18th century, the French aristocracy fell, Napoleon came in, and between about 1780 and 1820, men's fashions went from this to this. And here you can see the change. These later men's coats all have straight fronts you can button fully closed, and later fashion historians seem to have muddled these 19th century straight-line closed front coats with the curved front open coats of the 18th century. So you get a lot of things like this, which, you know, is fine for costume parties and LARPing and vaguely invoking the past and maybe even musical theater. Fun's fun, and no one is required to have perfect authenticity in order to have fun. But if people are really interested in true history and want to know what life was really like and how people really lived, it's good to look at what they really wore and clearly enjoyed wearing. Oftentimes, people in history can surprise us and show us how things are and were weirder and sillier and more inventive and more fun than we thought. So yeah.